let me see if we're live. I think I got a notification that we're live on YouTube. Yeah, we're live on YouTube. Let me look at Twitter, or also we could look at the chat as well.
Yes, it does look as if we're live.
The
Uh,
Instagram live is not working, it seems.
shall we proceed? Or do you want to take a moment? Hi, everybody. I think we're live. Uh, if you just bear with us for 1 minute, this is still a work in progress. This is our second live stream. So we're still getting the handle of this thing, and we're trying to ensure that people on Instagram are also able to watch.
It looks like Instagram's not working, but that's fine. At least we have YouTube and Twitter or X working.
Okay, why don't we proceed?
Yeah.
And apologies to any Instagram users who were trying to access us on that platform. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on Reason to Resist for our second live stream. I am with my compadre Rami Yahya this evening. If you watched our first live stream or Rami's recent report from Georgia, not the state, the country of Georgia, about the elections there and Western meddling in the internal politics of Georgia, you will know who Rami is. But just in case you don't, I'm going to invite our new Reason to Resist correspondent and also a friend of mine for a number of years to tell us a little more about himself.
Yes, of course. So yeah, my name is Rami Yahya. I'm born and raised in Montreal and was quite involved in Palestine activism in university at Concordia University. Concordia is known because we were able to cancel, what's his name, Benjamin Netanyahu, the war criminals talk at Concordia back in 2002. And ever since my involvement in Palestine activism, I was also involved with the student union, advocating for student rights. And more recently, I've been digital nomading the world, visiting the post-Soviet world and the post-Eastern Bloc world, and enjoying life over there. Most recently, well, I was in Ukraine when the war started, and I had quite an extremely nice, not nice, eventful day that day, leaving Ukraine, which I documented on my Instagram stories. And most recently, I was in Georgia and Moldova, documenting the elections and EU referendums, as well as the repercussions of these elections. So yes, as you mentioned, Dimitri, there was a little report that I made. It was not my proudest work, but it was a good footstep into the world of journalism, and I'm excited to keep doing this. So we're doing this every week for now, this live stream. And feel free to share in the comments your thoughts on what you expect from these live streams, and share your comments on what we have to say as well. We'll be reading some, ask some questions. We'll probably most likely keep some time at the end to answer these questions.
And we also invite your suggestions on places you think we should go. Both Rami and I want to report and have reported from the front line. We want to do a lot more of that. We happen to be, both of us, in Montreal today, where we're based because, we have an attachment to the city, but this is also where we have the most connections, I guess, familial and otherwise. But we spend a lot of time, reporting from the front line. That's a very important aspect of what we do on Reason to Resist. Rami, you've been in Moldova, Transnistria. You mentioned you were in Ukraine, you were in Georgia. What other sort of out-of-the-way places have you been in the last few years in the course of your digital nomadness?
So, I mean, it's not necessarily too shocking of a place, but I was in Tunisia. And one thing that was quite interesting in Tunisia was, there's a beach right across from like Tunis, like bordering the sea, which is called, there's a city called Hammamshat, which is a place which is where the PLO was based out of when they left Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War and after the 1982 Lebanon War. And what's particularly interesting about Hammamshat, and that's something that maybe some people don't know, is that, it was a place that Israel ended up bombarding and in some way completely destroying the place. So I was able to navigate around Hammamshat. I saw the only Palestinian person left of Hammamshat who was there back in during the bombing of the PLO encampment. So that's something that was extremely touching for me to see, to know that, well, I mean, I think there's a special connection between all these countries that were attacked by Israel. You look at Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Tunisia. I think that it reminds us that this is an international cause that we're fighting. We're fighting an entity that is a danger to the entire world. So that was quite interesting. Of course, there's Lebanon, but we have Dimitri, you've done your fair share of reporting over there. But I mean, pretty much every single post-Soviet country I've been to, except for Russia and Latvia, Lithuania, I've done enough of the Baltics.
Mhm. And when we say, the entity that is the greatest threat to humanity, I think, Rami, you'll agree with me that
Yeah.
that entity is a big blob that not only encompasses Israel, but also encompasses the governments of the West, certain of their proxies around the world, for example, South Korea, Japan, and so forth, which collectively, I think, and this is a theme that we've tried to stress on this program, are engaged or embarked upon a project of global hegemony with the United States at the head of this pack of rabid dogs. And, we never tire of talking about that. And this is one of the reasons why Rami and I have gone to these particular countries. We don't spend really a lot of time reporting from Western states. We try to focus on what is happening on the ground in non-Western states because they are the ones who are being targeted and have been for decades with this project of Western global hegemony. And they are the ones, frankly, who are putting up the greatest and fiercest resistance at this particular moment. Although there are certainly a lot of people in the West, many fine comrades living in Western countries who are also engaged in that struggle. So on that note, I just want to talk a few minutes, Rami, about the speaking tour that I've been on the last few days before we get into recent events and what transpired globally around in the last week or so. Um, as many of you will know, I've been on a speaking tour with a wonderful peace activist, friend of mine. I admire her work tremendously. Her name is Tamara Lorentz. She's probably in the peace movement, in Canada, one of the best known and most widely respected activists and academics. She's currently a candidate for a doctorate at the University of Waterloo Balsillie School of International Affairs. She has been targeted by the Canadian Security Intelligence Services, which is the Canadian version, not our, it certainly isn't our, but the Canadian version of the CIA. And like the CIA, it's not supposed to be spying on people domestically, but it revealed to Tamara when she recently returned from Russia at an airport in Canada. An agent of CSIS revealed that she's been under surveillance for many years, which, in my view as a lawyer here in Canada, is dubious, to put it mildly. But in any event, this is the kind of person that Tamara is: very outspoken, very passionate about peace and anti-militarism. And so she, at her suggestion, I joined her on a speaking tour in Ontario, Canada's most populous province, where she is based. And we had 4 events in the past week. We started in London, Ontario, where I was born and raised. It's a city of about 400,000, which is midway between Toronto and Detroit. Then we moved up to Waterloo, where she's doing her doctorate. Then we went to Toronto on Wednesday night. And then we had a night off on Thursday, and on Friday we were in the nation's capital, Ottawa. Every one of our events was either at capacity or above capacity. In Ottawa, we had standing room only. And we were joined in Ottawa, by the way, by another extraordinary peace activist, Larry Waslin, of the Ukrainian Canadian community and the president of the Canadian Peace Congress. I want to thank all the people who came out. We heard many kind remarks, and what encouraged me the most about this speaking tour is that I sense a change. I did a speaking tour 18 months ago right across Canada after returning from Crimea and Moscow about the Ukraine war and how we should try to bring it to an end for the sake of all the peoples of the region and the world. And I was met with a tremendous amount of opposition from the neocons in this country and from the right wing of the Ukrainian Canadian community, and even some people who, typically had been supporters and who were anti-imperialist, but in my respectful submission, had kind of fallen prey to the propaganda around the Ukraine war. So I got a lot of opposition. It's okay. We dealt with it. We ended up having a very good tour last year. But what really struck me about this tour is that there was a great deal more receptivity to the arguments that we're making. People were willing to listen to us respectfully, engage constructively. The efforts to shut us down while they were there were much more muted. And as I said at the end of the Ottawa um, presentation on Friday night, my own sense is that the reason for this is that a year of genocidal horrors in Gaza, broadcast to the world 24/7, have torn the mask off of Western imperialism to a degree we've not experienced in our lifetime. And a lot of people are waking up. A lot of people who um, already were partially aware of the reality of this propaganda system we have in the West and the fact that we are, you know, basically enthralled to the military industrial complex, but they still hadn't, I think, and I say this with the greatest of respect, necessarily appreciated the full extent of the capture of our governments by the military industrial complex. But I think the last year has really been a painful awakening for a lot of people. And I wish it didn't have to come to this, but maybe if there's a silver lining in all of the horror that we're witnessing and the Palestinian people are experiencing, is that maybe this is becoming a revolutionary moment, a moment when we finally take on this behemoth, this monster, the military industrial complex that has captured our governments and is a threat really to the existence of humanity. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Rami. I just wanted to share those thoughts with our audience about the speaking tour. And by the way, one other thing, we have one more event, Mississauga, if you live in the Toronto area, Mississauga on the 21st of November in the evening. You can find more details about that on my social media accounts. And that's kind of Canada's version of Dearborn, Michigan, Mississauga, very large Palestinian community. So we're looking forward to being greeted there by our brothers and sisters in the Canadian Palestinian community.
And Dimitri, maybe we should look into doing one in Montreal, considering we have the NATO conference happening later this week. So, Dimitri, there's been a lot of things going on since we last did our live stream, whether it is in West Asia, in Palestine, in Yemen. Did you want to maybe start by talking about updates that we've had in Gaza?
Yes. So there have been multiple reports over a period of weeks suggesting that the Israeli military is intent upon completely emptying northern Gaza of the indigenous Palestinian population and the refugees who have been there for many years, including bodies lying in the street, medical workers again being killed at an accelerated pace, civilian infrastructure, housing being leveled to the ground, what remains of it in northern Gaza. And of course, we're seeing similar patterns of depravity being directed at the population of Lebanon, particularly in the south of the country. But what really I think is striking about this period is that the resistance groups, whether it be the Islamic resistance in Lebanon or Islamic Jihad, Hamas, others, because it's not just those groups operating in Gaza, but others, have continued to inflict significant casualties on Israel's genocidal military, which is really quite, whatever you may think of these groups, the fact that they've been able to continue to put up armed resistance after all the carnage we have seen is, nothing short of miraculous. And whatever may have happened on October 7th, they are now locked in battle with the military of Israel. And that is where they are directing their attacks by all accounts. And maybe you could just pull up, Rami, for the benefit of our audience, the slide, soldier killed in northern Gaza.
IDF officer killed in Gaza.
And that one, you could do that one too.
Yeah, let's start with that one.
So this is the most recent report of a death of an Israeli soldier. This was an officer in the Israeli military killed. Actually, I'm sorry, this is not the most recent report. This is back on Monday. This is the oldest of the reports we're going to show to you. So this was an officer in central Gaza who was killed. And then if you can pull up uh, Rami, either of the other two slides I've included, which include 6 Israeli soldiers killed. Do you see that one?
Yep.
And this was one of the worst incidents for the Israeli military in the past year. This happened this week, 1 or 2 days after that Israeli officer was killed in Gaza. In one fell swoop, 6 Israeli soldiers. I believe that they were from the Golani Brigade, which is reputed to be the elite brigade of the Israeli military, and it has suffered very serious casualties during the course of the last year, including a drone attack on a cafeteria where there were a lot of Golani soldiers gathering for a meal a couple of months ago. That killed 4 and wounded dozens in one attack. And then if you pull up the most recent casualty report, which would be soldier killed in northern Gaza. Do you see that one, Rami?
Yes.
So this was published today, and you'll see that this soldier, he's reported to have been age 21. When I saw this photograph, I was amazed that he was actually of adult age. He looks like a teenager, but according to the Israeli military, he's 21 years old. He too was killed in the Gaza Strip. Interestingly, one person on social media commented that he didn't look like he was indigenous to the region. I'll leave it for you to decide whether that's the case. But in any event, this is just a sampling. These are just the deaths, the people who have, the soldiers who have been killed in action in the past week, and that the Israeli military has acknowledged as having been killed in action. You know, for every soldier who's killed, there are multiple people, depending upon the nature of the war, who are wounded. So you can assume that there were probably a few dozen soldiers wounded over the course of the past week. And of course, as in all wars, you know, each side has an incentive to understate its casualties and overstate the casualties of the enemy. So I think this is basically telling us the minimum, and that the situation is probably much worse. And for what it's worth, Hezbollah reports that it has actually killed and wounded many more soldiers than the Israeli military is admitting it has lost. And we've also seen reports in the past week that the report rate for reservists has fallen. At the beginning of this genocidal rampage, over 100% of reservists reported for duty, according to the Israeli military. And now that number is down to about 85%. And the Israeli media itself is reporting that that this is due to burnout. That's the word that the Israeli military is using. And some soldiers have gone public with the fact that they are basically an open mutiny. They refuse to report for duty because they feel that the war is being fought for the personal ambitions of Benjamin Netanyahu and not for any achievable objective. The other thing I want to talk about, so, you know, we focused upon the losses of the Israeli military. I'd want to just sort of shift over to, you know, the reports we're getting out of the resistance, particularly in Lebanon. And if you could pull up Resistance Operations 1, Rami, we can start there.
And Dimitri, while I pull this up, there's also massive cases of Israeli soldiers committing suicide coming back from service. And this is not being announced as casualties of war.
Absolutely. This is undoubtedly much of that information is being suppressed as well. That's an important point. So what you're looking at here, everybody, is a screenshot of a report published by the Islamic Resistance in Lebanon, which is the military wing of Hezbollah, today, relating to its military operations on November 16th. So, by the way, you can find this on a Telegram channel called the Military Media, which is one of the sources I consult every day to get the perspective of the resistance groups. In the military media, you're not just going to find reports by the military wing of Hezbollah, you're going to find reports, for example, by the popular militias in Iraq, which I'm going to get to in a moment. You'll find reports from Ansar Allah in Yemen, statements by the Iranian government, many, many statements by resistance groups inside Palestine. And so I go there not because I assume that everything that appears on this channel is true. I don't make that assumption. I don't make that assumption about any side to a war. As I mentioned, there's always a strong incentive on the part of belligerents in a war to disseminate disinformation. That's part of warfare. But if you want to try to get a sense of what's happening on the battlefield, I think you have to listen to all voices and analyze them critically. So that's why I also go every day to the Israeli media. I spend as much time looking at the Israeli media as I spend reading the statements of resistance groups, so I can get a sense of what they're both saying and try to make sense of it. In any event, this report, this is the first half of the report issued this morning by the military wing of Hezbollah about its operations yesterday. And you'll see there are 15 separate operations. And I just want to just pick one randomly here so that I can give you a flavor of what they're reporting every day. Look at number 4, which is in the top half of the page. And it says, at 10 a.m., the Islamic resistance fighters targeted Shraga base, the administrative headquarters of the Golden Brigade north of occupied Acre, with a barrage of rockets. Now, let's look at the next one, 5. At 10:30 a.m., the Islamic resistance fighters launched an aerial operation with a squadron of assault drones targeting an Israeli forces gathering near a military checkpoint in Avivim settlement. The operation hit its targets with precision. Now, typically, I read this to you just to give you an example of what they're reporting. What they do, the Islamic resistance, is they tell you the precise time at which they launched the attack. They describe the target of the attack in detail, which is invariably military, and they'll give you some information on the weapons they employed. If they say rockets, in my experience, generally that means Katyusha rockets, but sometimes they'll be very precise and they'll say we fired a Fadi 1 or a Fadi 3, for example, a squad of assault drones, glide drones. And the reason why I point this out is the more detailed reports are, the harder it is for them to lie, and the easier it is for people to ascertain whether they're lying. If they just made some kind of generic, ambiguous statement about having struck some targets with some unspecified weapons at some time during the day in some part of northern occupied Palestine, how do you disprove the statement? How do you ascertain whether it's true or false? Because it's so ambiguous. But they are very precise. And in my experience, many times the Israeli media will confirm what the Islamic resistance has reported in terms of the military operations it has launched. So I also want to show you the second half of this statement. So Rami, if you could pull up Resistance Operations 2.
No, that's still the first one, right?
Yep. Thank you. So this is the second half of the statement, and you'll see the very end, it ends with 26. That means on Saturday, November 17th, or 16th, I should say, the Islamic resistance reports that it launched 26 separate military operations. And if you look at 22, which is in the middle of the page, it actually consists of several military operations, 5 separate military operations. And you'll see here, they have a special category of military operations which are devoted to Hassan Nasrallah. They call them the Khaybar Operations series. And you'll see number 22, there are actually 5 separate attacks, all of them on major military bases in the Haifa area, using a variety of sophisticated weapons. Usually the Islamic resistance will use only its most sophisticated missiles in the Khaybar operations, which are done in honor of their now deceased Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, who was assassinated by Israel a few weeks ago. So what I want to point out here is that up until the ground operation began, The Israeli ground operation began in early October, so we're about 6 weeks ago. As I said, I've been following these reports on a daily basis. The number of reports on average, in my experience, up until the beginning of October, was 10 to 15 military operations a day. There you saw there were 26. The number of military operations, my sense is, I haven't done precise math, since the beginning of the ground operation on a daily basis between 25 and 30. So there has been approximately a doubling in the number of military operations that the Islamic resistance has conducted since the beginning of October. Now, I don't know for sure that they actually do each one of these, but I've not seen any evidence to contradict what they're reporting, and many times the Israeli media actually confirms the substance of the report. And so the point here is that the whole ground operation was designed to bring an end to the attacks on northern occupied Israel. And we were told before it began that because of these so-called decapitation strikes, the killing of top Hezbollah commanders, that Hezbollah had been fatally weakened. But in fact, what we're witnessing and this is reflected in the casualties that the Israeli military is reporting in South Lebanon, is a substantial increase, both in the number of military operations and in the number of casualties that Israel is experiencing in South Lebanon and on the border with Lebanon. So this, by any rational measure, I think we can say that the objectives of this military operation this ground operation into South Lebanon has been a massive failure until now, and there's no indication that it's going to actually succeed. Rami, you have any thoughts about all of this?
Well, I mean, we also need to understand that, I actually met some people from Gaza when I was in Athens, and I asked them, just some basic questions that any Palestinian diaspora would ask someone from Palestine, related to, what is the presence of the resistance? Is it something that you feel every day? And they tell us that, the resistance will oftentimes prepare these operations months ahead of time. They just stand by around and they wait for the perfect moment to detonate. So when we look at these 26 activities happening every day, these are prepared many, many months before, and it's following guerrilla tactics that we've seen in Vietnam, and all throughout the Intifadas, and also in Lebanon during the Israeli occupation of Beirut. I mean, it's not very surprising. We've known this since the beginning, that any attack that Israel will do on the people of Gaza will be something that will target. It's indiscriminate. They don't know who to attack. There's no way to crush the resistance, and the resistance actually is a bit omnipresent in a sense where it's people defending their properties, their land, their families, and at any moment anyone could take action. So it doesn't necessarily have to be coordinated. So in reality, I think people, I mean, Dimitri, I don't think it comes as a surprise to any one of us that this war was lost from the get-go for Israel. Now,
Absolutely.
these losses carry on beyond Lebanon and Gaza, as you mentioned.
Can we go to Iraq? I forgot to mention that, Rami. This is
Sure.
the slide, Islamic resistance in Iraq.
Okay, I'm not the quickest with the pictures. So Islamic resistance in Iraq.
You're doing a great job. You're much better than I
By
was.
the way, chat, am I being loud? Like, can you guys hear me pretty well?
I can hear you fine, but maybe the audience.
Oh, a tad bit louder. I'll try. Maybe I'll just speak a bit louder.
Okay. And if anybody thinks my volume is too high or too low, please let us know. So this is another, again, on the military media channel. This was published this morning or yesterday, Saturday, November 13th, or maybe it was this morning. And this is by the Islamic resistance in Iraq. There are some popular militias in Iraq who have been routinely firing drones, cruise missiles, and other projectiles at occupied Palestine. And what has happened, again, since the so-called decapitation strikes took place and the ground operation began in South Lebanon, is that there has been a huge increase in the number of reported attacks by the Islamic resistance in Iraq. You'll see at the top, it says Statement 7. They reported yesterday 7 separate attacks on Israel. And again, you'll see there in the bottom, there's a video. They'll typically show the launch of whatever projectiles they're firing. A lot of times they're drones. Sometimes these are suicide drones, of course. They're not meant to return. They carry explosive warheads. They also fire cruise missiles, other rockets. And there has been virtually no reporting on this at all, as far as I can tell, in the mainstream media. The fact that there are resistance groups in Iraq which have not only been attacking Israel on a daily basis for the last 6 to 8 weeks, but are now launching attacks multiple times a day. And there is a very aggressive censorship regime in place in Israel right now. You could go to jail for reporting on the damage that is inflicted by these attacks. And in fact, an American journalist for the Gray Zone, Jeffrey Lofredo, after airing footage of an Iranian missile, or the crater created by an Iranian missile, about 300 feet, about 100 meters from the headquarters of the Mossad in Tel Aviv. He was arrested by the Israeli military and beat up and put in solitary confinement for a week and then released. That's how oppressive this regime is. I believe Jeffrey, by the way, is Jewish. I don't know if I could be wrong about that, but they didn't care about his background at all. All they cared about, the Israeli military, was that he reported that a hypersonic missile from Iran came very, very close to destroying the headquarters of the Mossad. So we just don't know at the end of the day, because of this very aggressive censorship regime that Israel's military has put in place, how much damage all of these things are doing. The resistance groups don't have any sophisticated satellite technology that allows them to do sort of damage assessments after the fact. They pretty much rely upon what locals are reporting on the ground. So I would imagine, however, based on what we've seen thus far, that there is a lot more damage than we're being told about. And with that, yeah, Rami, why don't you talk to us about what's going on in Yemen? Because that's
Yeah.
also a very interesting story.
So on the 13th of November, the Yemeni armed forces were able to target 2 U.S. Navy warships with around like 8 drones and these anti-ship cruise missiles. And well, I don't think it's the first time that the Yemeni armed forces, or commonly known as the Houthis, yeah. So it's not the first time that they're targeting the U.S. Navy ships. And what's important to know is that America has been trying to like create a free access to pass for ships going through the Red Sea to dock into the port of Eilat in Israel. And I was looking at the port of Eilat today, and there was barely one cargo ship docked over there. So I think it's very safe to say that whatever America has been doing in the Red Sea is still not working, and the Yemeni armed forces really are emboldened enough and empowered to not see the United States Navy warships in the Red Sea as a threat. And what's particularly interesting is that the scale of attacks that the Yemeni armed forces have been doing in the Red Sea has been escalating over and over. And more recently, they've been targeting the port of Eilat directly, as well as Yahya Saree calls attacks on the port of Haifa, the port of Jaffa, as well as Ashkelon, which is maybe the closest city to the Gaza Strip. And what's also extremely interesting to know is that, well, I mean, we've known this from the beginning, but the Yemeni armed forces every single statement that they put up announcing the attacks that they've been doing, and with a disclaimer saying that they're ready to stop these attacks the day there is a ceasefire and peace in Gaza, as well as say, an end to the illegal blockade. Now, these attacks in Gaza committed by the Yemeni armed forces have, shocked the Pentagon and the U.S. defense quite a lot, to the point where a gentleman of the name of Bill LaPlante, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, said that basically he says, well, what I've seen of what the Houthis have done in the last 6 months is something that I'm just shocked, right? So the attacks are escalating. They're using pretty much some self-made weapons, using resources possibly from Iran, and these attacks are quite scalable because they're using weapons that are quite cheap, under the cost of $20,000 per drone or per anti-ship cruise missiles. And when they're targeting U.S. Navy warships, there's a huge disbalance or asymmetry to the cost of defending against these weapons. So the Pentagon is actually extremely impressed by the Houthi stockpile of missiles, and all of their weapons. Well, their weapons have some of them have a reach of around some of the missiles have a reach of 2,000 kilometers, and the drones is 2,500. That means that nowhere in Israel could be considered fully immune to Yemeni attacks. Now, and the attacks that the attacks that Yemeni armed forces have done on the port of Eilat, Yafa, and Ashkelon have been claimed to be fully repelled by the IDF. But what's quite interesting to know is that when Yemen says that they achieve their targets, these targets could also be that they just want to know what tools or mechanism of defense is Israel employing to defend these military bases that Yemen is targeting. Mm-hmm. Because whether they're actually getting hit or not, just being able to gather the intelligence of how Israel is defending these bases is then information that could be passed along to different actors, such as Iran, when it did its attack on the 1st of October that you've mentioned, and resulted in heavy casualties for Israel. Well, mm-hmm. That could possibly come from intel that they were able to gather when they did their simulations or their first attacks on these military bases. Mm-hmm. So
I just want to mention, you mentioned Yafa. I think that in that case, I don't know if we're talking about the same attack on Yafa, but there was a drone fired by Ansar Allah in Yemen that actually went, as I understand, over Egyptian territory. Then it crossed the Mediterranean waters and entered into Israeli airspace from the Mediterranean. It actually did kill an Israeli soldier in Tel Aviv, and the Israeli military admitted in that particular case that he was struck. I think that was a bit of an eye-opener. And while we're on the subject of surprising attacks, of course, there was the successful drone attack, successful in the sense that it hit its target. It hit Netanyahu's house in a coastal city, an affluent coastal city in Israel a couple of weeks ago. So clearly these resistance groups have the technology to penetrate Israel's air defenses. There's just no question about that right now. And we have not yet seen, a full-blown assault. All these resistance groups could fire huge volleys of missiles simultaneously, including Iran. I can't imagine how Israel could escape massive destruction if they chose to do that, because even acting individually, they're able to routinely penetrate Israel's air defenses.
And as I was mentioning, right, the intelligence gathered is then being sent out to the shared across the axis of resistance, and that's how we possibly ended up with the impressive attack on the 1st of October, which resulted in heavy casualties on U.S. Israeli military bases. Now, what we know is that after the attack of the 1st of October that Iran did, Israel promised a retaliation, which it ended up doing so on the 26th of October. And we spoke about this on previous chats. It was quite a failed attack. There were reports coming out that possibly Israel backtracked on its full plan to attack Iran because it possibly detected S-400 air defense systems. One thing that comes up that we've heard, I think, in an interview 2 days ago by an Iranian spokesperson, is that they actually don't really have the interest at the moment to buy S-400s, and they're instead developing their own internal air defense system built in-house. And well, we know that Iran has been able to produce these weapons at extremely low costs. So, and if they don't see a need in using foreign air defense systems, that's a testament of their ability to defend themselves and developing their own technologies that is less prone to possibly foreign attacks.
I just want to say something about that, Rami. You and I we met the Russian ambassador to Canada a couple of weeks ago when we went to the embassy to interview him. And by the way, you can find that interview, which I think is quite enlightening, on Reason to Resist channel. And as you may recall, Rami, I asked him about reports that the Russians had provided S-400 air defense systems to Iran. And his answer was, I'm not privy to the precise equipment that the government has provided, but the Russian Federation does cooperate militarily with Iran. And, there is assistance without getting into the details of it. So the other thing I want to mention about this is that in a very interesting, informative interview that retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the former chief of staff to Colin Powell when he was the Secretary of State in the Bush administration, he just did an interview with Chris Hedges, really enlightening interview, which I watched in its entirety. And he said that his sources tell him, and you can imagine he's got some sources in the Pentagon. He was the chief of staff to the Secretary of State under the Bush administration. Told him that the Israeli warplanes discovered when they were about 100 kilometers, it was either miles or kilometers outside of Iran, that Iranian air defense systems had locked onto them. And so at that point, they decided to discharge their weapons, their payload, and return to Israel rather than continue into Iranian airspace, because they felt that there was going to be a bloodbath, that they were going to get shot down in large numbers. Again, I have no way of knowing whether this report is accurate, but certainly it's consistent with what we've seen after the fact, because there's very, very little evidence, almost none, that Israel inflicted serious damage on Iran when it escalated the matter. It calls it a retaliation. In fact, it was Iran that was retaliating on October 1st to the destruction of its consulate in Damascus and the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and countless other aggressions by Israel and its Western backers. The Israelis call it a retaliation, but whatever you call it, certainly the evidence suggests that it was a massive failure compared to what it was advertised to be.
And last week on the live stream, we spoke about the leaked documents of the of Israel and United States' plan to attack Iran. There was a bit of a nice discussion around this. We weren't sure if it was possibly like an intentful leak from the United States, or whether it was truly like someone who like a protest leak, whatever you want to call it, someone who was wanted to support the Iranian resistance. But we were able to this week it was announced that they arrested a man called Asif William Rahman, who was stationed in Cambodia.
Sorry, who arrested him, Rami?
It was the United States government. What we know about him is that he was part of the CIA. They arrested him under charges of leaking these documents, right? So on the 18th of October, documents dated from the 15th and 16th of October were leaked onto Telegram, and sent over to the Iranian government. So maybe this is what also expedited Israel's retaliation, Israel's attack on Iran, and also its failed attack on Iran. But he's currently now sent to Guam, and he will be deported back to Virginia, where he was going to stand trial. But what's important to know about these leaked documents is that it announces a couple of it's nothing new for people that are critical of the United States and Israel, but we have proof in media now that there's the leaked documents admitted that the United States are aware of Israel's nuclear programs. It's an actual recognition of it, something that we always knew. But also the extent of America's support of Israel in attacking Iran. We know that the United States provided Israel with coordinates as well as advisory on how to best prepare its attack on Iran, as well as recommendations on the types of weapons to use and the logistics behind doing the attack. So there's truly now there's no more illusion really removing the fact that the United States is entirely complicit in destabilizing the region and in attacking Iran. Um, Now, Dimitri, this is just a quick question that I had for you. Is there any legal basis that Iran could hold against the United States for its complicity on on the attack of Iranian territorial integrity and sovereignty?
Absolutely. They have multiple grounds to assert claims under international law against the United States based upon um, uh, the sanctions that they've imposed upon Iran. These are unilateral sanctions. They were not approved by the UN Security Council. So those are a violation of the UN Charter. The Iranians, according to the International Atomic Energy Association, were complying with the JCPOA, which is the acronym for the nuclear deal that the Obama administration negotiated with Iran. It was designed effectively to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon in exchange for sanctions relief. The Iranians agreed to severe restraints on their nuclear program, which few, if any, other states would agree to. Certainly, the United States, Britain, and France, which have nuclear weapons, would never agree to those restraints. And despite their complying with the restraints, the Trump administration pulled the U.S. out and imposed even more punishing sanctions on Iran. When Biden came into power, he had the option of restoring the deal, but he didn't. And he maintained punishing sanctions on Iran, which are affecting the civilian population, innocent civilian population, far more than people in positions of power in the government. And then, of course, there was the killing of Qasem Soleimani by the Trump administration. I believe that was 2019. They assassinated somebody who was actually on a peace mission in Iraq. That was
By
not
the
only a
United States.
violation of Iranian sovereignty, it was also a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. And in my trip to Baghdad earlier this year, I spoke to representatives of the resistance, and they said that they pointed out to me that they didn't just kill Soleimani in that attack, they killed military officials from the Iraqi government. So that was a blatant violation of Iranian and Iraqi sovereignty. And then, of course, all of the weaponry they've been providing to Israel, which Israel used probably to destroy. I don't know exactly what weapons were used to destroy the Iranian consulate in Damascus, but very likely the U.S. was involved in some way in that. That was a flagrant violation of Iranian sovereignty, an act of war. I could go on and on, Rami. The Iranians, whatever you may think of their government, and there's many things about it that I don't like, but whatever you may think about their government, the fact is that they've shown a tremendous amount of restraint, and they have been, relative to the United States and Israel, throughout the last 20, 30 years in a defensive posture. And it's amazing, frankly, that they haven't used their prolific missile capacity to lay waste to the civilian infrastructure of Israel. Given everything we've been told about the Iranian government over the past few years, it's remarkable that they haven't done that. And they've shown this restraint. They're clearly trying to avoid a full-blown war, and I think they would be thrilled if Israel stopped the genocide in Gaza, so that everybody could lay down their arms and we could get down to the business of negotiating a state for the Palestinian people. But Israel and the West have no interest in that whatsoever.
Now, despite the failed attack on Iran by Israel on October 1st, Iran has been quite adamant in responding to Israel's attack. We know, well, they've been saying this since the next day of the attack. Now, my question, sorry, on the October 26th. So my question, well, not my question, but the analysis here is that Iran has been maybe waiting until the result of the U.S. elections to know how to best respond to Israel's attack. We know that Trump's inauguration is on the 7th of January. And my understanding from reports that I've been reading online is that it might be in Iran's interest to control the level of escalation. We know that Trump would possibly use escalation in the region as a bartering chip to push people to comply with America's vision in the region. I mean, how do you envision possibly Iran gradually escalating to like a peak on January 7th before Trump's inauguration, and then forcing Trump to be in a position where he has to de-escalate, since there's really no more leverage in their hands.
Well, I think the Iranians probably have been watching quite closely how Trump has the decisions he's made in terms of forming a cabinet uh, since he was elected, and the signs are not promising. We'll get into this in some more detail after we talk about Ukraine, but um, people like Mike Waltz and Stefanik and Marco Rubio, who apparently is going to be the Secretary of State if he's confirmed by the Senate. These people have a hate on for Iran, and Iran did say before the election that they were going to respond to the last attack by Israel, and that it would be much more painful than the prior attack. So I don't know, Rami. It's a very difficult. I understand that there are intense debates going on within the Iranian government. The president apparently is uh, less hawkish than the supreme leader, and then certain persons in the Iranian military. But if I were them and I were looking at this situation dispassionately, I would say, what is the point of uh, restraining ourselves further and allowing Israel to believe that it can get away with attacking our sovereign territory if Trump is going to put into power people who seem determined to destroy our country and to impose American hegemony over the people of our country. I mean, my guess is that they're ultimately going to respond and that it will be more severe than the last attack. But again, all of this could be avoided. It can't be said too much. All of this could be avoided if Israel stopped the genocide in Gaza and began to respect the basic human rights of the Palestinian people.
Now, Dimitri, there's also a few other things that happen in the Middle East that we didn't really talk about, and I'm curious to know your thoughts. Well, Israel, for Netanyahu admitted that Israel committed the pager attack in Lebanon. Now, this is something that we've always knew. However, Israel often has a policy of strategic ambiguity, where it refuses to acknowledge things publicly, either because of legal implications or to in some way protect themselves from Western criticism or other reasons of this sort. Now, do you think that we're kind of seeing a shift in Israel's policy now of being blatantly more? I mean, there's no more red lines for them. The world has shown that Israel could commit whatever it wants, and there's going to be no real repercussion. So, do you see like a change in Israel's strategy going forward, where they don't really need to hide any of their crime? I mean, I kind of know where you're going to go with this, but yeah, do you have any comments?
Well, actually, the Netanyahu regime admitted a week ago, this was unusual, as you indicated, based on its prior conduct, that it is behind the pager attack. And Netanyahu said that, I specifically authorized that attack. So they become so arrogant, so hubristic in the Israeli regime that they're not even, they're abandoning the policy of strategic ambiguity, which was in place for many decades. They think they can get away with anything, basically. And why wouldn't they believe that based upon the way Western governments have behaved? There seems to be absolutely no red line when it comes to the relations between Western governments and Israel.
And just before we get to Ukraine, well, the Lebanese government received a ceasefire proposal by the United States, which, from my understanding, demands the dismantlement of Hezbollah. And the Lebanese government rejected that proposal. However, has shown maybe it was some strategic enthusiasm. I just don't see Hezbollah ever disbanding itself, especially not under, without a settlement in the Middle East. But how do you interpret the ceasefire proposal? It seemed like the Lebanese government's concern mostly came from the fact that there were third-party observers that would be supervising the dismantlement of Hezbollah,
Mhm.
which is something that is not acceptable for Hezbollah themselves or for the Lebanese government. But do you kind of see the Lebanese government taking a bit more the side of the United States and possibly funding a settlement by dismantling the resistance in the south.
Rami, as you're aware, I've been to Lebanon 5 times in the past 2 years, and 4 times since the genocide began in October of last year. I don't claim to be the most expert person when it comes to Lebanon, but certainly the impression that I formed, amongst others, when I was there, is that there is no government in Lebanon. There really is no central government anymore. The country is barely hanging together by a thread. The most powerful force militarily and politically in Lebanon is Hezbollah. I think that's probably more true now than it was before this genocide began. The Lebanese army does not have the capacity to disarm Hezbollah. I think that's a pipe dream. They can try, and there will be another civil war, which frankly I think is what the United States government wants, because Israel can't defeat Hezbollah, so why not turn it in Lebanon into a failed state? I think that is ultimately what they're trying to do here by speaking to people who are not aligned with Hezbollah and who don't have the power to force Hezbollah to do anything. Hezbollah, there's absolutely no way, this is delusional, that Hezbollah is going to voluntarily disarm as long as the Israeli government continues to do what it's doing to the Palestinian people, continues to illegally occupy Lebanese land, continues to use its military force in ways that are grossly violative of international law. There's zero chance of that happening. To be perfectly blunt about it, I can't imagine the Americans don't know this. I think they understand this perfectly well. They know that their so-called ceasefire proposal is a non-starter. And let's remember that the person who apparently is leading these negotiations, Amos Hochstein, the U.S. representative in Lebanon, was a member of the Israeli military. So he's not interested in a ceasefire any more than Netanyahu is. This is all kabuki theater. They're not going to ever persuade Hezbollah to disarm in the current circumstances, and they know it. They're just trying to project the image of trying to avoid a bigger war. This is the fraud, the spectacle that we've been witnessing for over a year now.
And just beyond the envoy to Lebanon, right, Amos? I mean, we saw the United States being complicit in bombing Iran. How can we ever see them as an honest broker or mediator in the region, whether it is in Lebanon, in Iran, in Yemen, or in Gaza? So yeah, I think I'm not quite sure where entertaining these discussions even go. But carrying on, there's been quite a lot of development in Ukraine. Do you want to start with kind of how the front lines are moving?
Yeah, I'll be brief here because you can spend a lot of time talking on this subject, and there's plenty of information out there on the independent media already. But basically, the front line is moving in a bad direction for the Ukrainian government all over the place. In Kursk, where there was this much ballyhooed offensive by Ukraine a couple of months ago, much of the land that was taken by them has been recaptured by Russian forces. There's now, I think they've taken back approximately 50% of the land that was initially seized by Ukrainian forces. And little by little, they're annihilating whatever resistance exists in that pocket of land. Up in the Kupiansk direction, which is a the northeastern area of the battlefield, Russian forces have actually entered Kupiansk, which is a very important city in that area. And in other parts of the Kupiansk direction, the Russian forces have advanced up to the Oskol River. And the Ukrainian forces on the eastern side of the river are in a very serious dilemma because it's very difficult for them to be resupplied. They have the river at their backs. Then you go down to Chasov Yar, the Bakhmut direction. That has been slower moving for the Russian forces, but they are gradually penetrating deeper and deeper into Chasov Yar. In the Siversk direction, which is south of Chasov Yar, they are now very close to the strategically important town of Siversk itself, held by Ukrainian forces throughout this conflict. But the worst place of all is the Donbass. The Ukrainians lost heavily fortified city months ago. They are called Avdiivka. Then more recently, in the last month, they lost Ugledar, which was a very powerful fortress in the southeast of Ukraine that the Russians had tried in vain with significant casualties to take for many months, and then just suddenly it collapsed. The Russians have taken another town in this area, heavily fortified, called Selidova. That area, that's where the front line is moving to the west at the fastest pace. And now the Russians are attacking to the east in the Zaporozhye direction. This has placed enormous pressure on the Ukrainian military, which has very few reserves left. It's vastly outnumbered. Its weapon stocks are much smaller than those of Russia, and they're less sophisticated. Frankly, their air defense systems are not as effective as the Russian air defense systems, and they don't have hypersonic missiles. The Russians do, and there's no air defense system that the West has that can take down a hypersonic missile. That's just the reality. So that's the background. And with that, I'd like to just pull up, Rami, if you could, the statement of the G7 that they just put out about the Ukraine war, which is just just an exercise in stunning delusion. So you'll see this was put out on Saturday, yesterday, and it was almost a carbon copy of the statements we've seen from the G7 from the very beginning, including when Ukraine was in a much better position, militarily and economically. We, the leaders of the Group of Seven, reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine for as long as it takes. They don't actually say what it is. They kind of imply it, but they don't come out and say. And that's very important. What exactly are they supporting Ukraine to achieve? We should know their precise objectives. So we, as citizens of these countries that are giving them so much money, the Ukrainians, and so much weaponry, and increasing the risk of a nuclear war with Russia by each passing day, we should know what our government's objectives are. But they're kind of murky about that. And then they go on and they say, I want to go down to the last paragraph, first sentence: Russia remains the sole obstacle to just and lasting peace. They just completely ignoring the fact that there was a coup in 2014 that they orchestrated, which removed a democratically elected Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was trying to maintain good relations with both the West and Russia. They're ignoring the fact that NATO powers promised Russia, the Soviet Union leadership, that NATO would not expand eastward. They're ignoring the fact that they used the Minsk Accords to basically hoodwink Russia into allowing Ukraine to rearm after its military had suffered significant losses in the 2014 civil war. They're ignoring all the civilians, the Russian-speaking civilians in the Donbass who were killed by the Ukrainian military after the coup in 2014. For them to say that Russia remains the sole obstacle to just and lasting peace, this is sheer delusion. Either that, or their mendacity knows no limits whatsoever. So there's no indication, unfortunately, in that statement that they are interested in any kind of concessions, which is it's unavoidable. You're going to have to make concessions to bring this war to an end. And if you don't make concessions, it's just going to get worse for Ukraine. A lot of us have been saying that for 2 years. Now, against this backdrop, Rami, there was an interesting call coming from Germany. Why don't you tell people about that?
So I think it was on Friday, right? So on November 15th, Olaf Scholz ended up calling Vladimir Putin. It was the first Western leader to interact with President Putin in the past 2 years, and his own first call with Putin in the last 2 years. And I mean, this comes at a funny time. First of all, Scholz called on Putin to show seriousness to end the war, which is, I mean, I think the lack of seriousness comes from the Western side, which has waited for Trump's victory to even call Vladimir Putin to negotiate an end to this war. And not just this, Ukrainian constitution forbids any form of negotiations with Russia. So if there's any lack of seriousness in ending this war, comes from the West themselves. Also, Dimitri, when you were talking about how the front line was moving, the front line is clearly moving against Ukraine. So, if there's any form of leverage in these negotiations and to show any form of seriousness, must deeply come from the West themselves. And what Scholz called on Putin to do was to put an end to to the occupation of the lands that were conquered after the 2002 invasion of Ukraine. Um, I mean, there's clearly no leverage over Russia to secede these lands. Um, Now, one thing that Dimitri, we just heard about just a few hours before this phone call is that Biden gave the green light to Ukraine to use U.S.-made long-range weapons to attack Russia.
Mhm.
The way I interpret this is Biden trying to change the status quo, right? To create a new status quo. So that when Trump gets to power, he'll be in a tougher position to put an end to this war.
Mhm.
So the United States had the last 2 years to give the Ukraine the right to use the long-range missiles. Yet they've waited until they lost the elections um, to create some last-minute form of escalation, which is for sure going to fail. The same way the United States supported Ukraine in doing the Kursk attack, and although it lasted a bit longer than the Russians would have hoped to end, it still ended up as a failure. Yeah.
So I think that this is the timeline here is really important. There's one additional event, Rami, which you may not be aware of, which we have to add to this timeline. So, Trump wins the election last week. He was adamant. I'm sorry, not last. Was it the week before? Time flies by when you're having fun, I guess. So November 5th. Um, then uh, he begins to assemble his team, his national security team. It looks like he's putting people on that team who, unlike the rhetoric he employed during the campaign, actually want to continue the proxy war. J.D. Vance, his vice president, doesn't. He's been very clear about that. At least that's what he says. Tulsi Gabbard, we'll get back to her, the nominee to be the director of national intelligence, which is a pretty important position. She's been very clear that she claims not to want to continue the war and bring it to an end in Ukraine. But these people like Rubio and Mike Waltz and Stefanik, uh, to name but a few, are very, very pro-Ukraine, very pro-escalation. So this is what happened in the first stage of this most recent series of events. Then you get the call from Olaf Scholz to Putin. And the Russian government says that it was Germany that initiated that call. They didn't ask for it, it was Germany. And based on the public statements, there's no indication that in that call, Olaf Scholz indicated any willingness on the part of Western governments or Ukraine to make any concessions. None whatsoever. It's one thing to pick up the phone and say, yeah, you should negotiate. But if your position is you should negotiate away all the advantages that you currently have, that's not likely to lead anywhere. And it seems like that's what Scholz did. And as you pointed out, Zelensky was publicly saying to Scholz, don't even talk to Putin. Not only was he saying, don't make concessions, don't even talk to the man. Then you get this statement from the G7 on Saturday, which looked to me like just more of the same. Absolutely no indication at all in that statement of a willingness to compromise in any way with the Russian Federation. And last night, and this is the piece we haven't talked about yet, Russia launched a massive missile strike across Ukraine. And the primary targets appear to have been what remains of the electricity grid in Ukraine. And we're on the cusp of winter. And so that's what happened last night. Uh, my guess, my sense of it all is that the Russian government decided that all the signals it was seeing, it was looking at Trump's picks for his cabinet, people like Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz. He was looking at the G7 statement. He heard Olaf Scholz basically tell him, you need to make all the concessions on your side. We're not making any. And he said, to hell with it. We're going to press forward with our plan. And our plan was to wreck what remains of the Ukrainian electricity grid, which again, many of us have been warning about. And then you get this announcement hours ago, literally 2 hours before we started the live stream, from the Biden administration that it is authorizing. It's actually, I don't think there's been an official announcement. I think that the Biden administration has sent out anonymous officials to tell the US media that Biden has given the green light. to use long-range weapons. And the Russian Federation has been very clear that this would be regarded by Russia as a major escalation. Uh, so, what is going on here? I think possibly what the Biden administration is trying to do is to lock the Trump administration, the incoming administration, into an escalatory posture vis-a-vis Russia. It actually wants to escalate the war to a point where the Trump administration will feel itself boxed into a corner, and it will have to pursue and even worsen uh, the, uh, the proxy war policies of the Biden administration. That's my best guess about what's going on. But what is very clear, whatever is motivating all of this, is that things within the last 48 hours have taken a turn for the worse in Ukraine. And people should be very concerned about this. I don't think the Russian Federation is bluffing when they amended their nuclear policy. Let's be very clear about this. Their policy around nuclear weapons around the time that they were hearing that the British government and these rabid dogs in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, these governments are completely nuts. They seem to want a nuclear war with Russia. Um, the Russians revised their nuclear policy as all of this was going on. And they made clear that any attack that was considered, any attack by a Western proxy that they considered to constitute a threat to the survival of Russia would be viewed as an attack by the West itself, and that the United States government would not be spared. The United States people would not be spared. People should take these threats very seriously. So we're in a very dangerous place right now, this interregnum between Biden and Trump, and all of these machinations going on, but the signs are very concerning.
Right, and just to emphasize, Dimitri, right, the Russian government mentioned more precisely the manufacturer of these weapons would be held accountable and guilty. So an attack of U.S.-made weapons on Russian territory, whether it is Moscow or any other city of the sort, would be seen as an attack by the United States on Russia. Now, Dimitri, there's a couple of more topics that we wanted to talk about. Do we want to prioritize Israel's place in sports or Trump's picks?
I mean, why don't we just talk briefly about Trump's picks before we move on to these more discrete events?
Well, so more recently, just earlier this week, it was announced that Marco Rubio would be Secretary of State. Well, he first of all called for direct and disproportionate measures to be taken on Iran, and that the only way for Iran to ever comply with its what it calls its obligation would be if it was put in a corner and under severe pressure. And using the word disproportionate measures sounds quite hostile, to say the very least. But on a slightly different note, while Trump was doing his appointments, his transition team, as well as Elon Musk, ended up meeting with the permanent mission of Iran to the United Nations, as maybe as a sign or a little bone to show that they're possibly looking to de-escalate. Now, another interesting pick is Tulsi Gabbard as intelligence director. And this was, I saw a nice tweet by Scott Ritter saying that the chain of command, basically the president of the United States gets briefed by the intelligence director, and then the strategy or the decisions are then executed by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. So Tulsi Gabbard at the National Intelligence, although she is in her own way a different form of war hawk, there seems to be a bit of faith and hope from Scott Ritter's side. I wouldn't see that same kind of optimism for any drastic change in the Middle East or in Ukraine. But that was quite an important pick that was made. And then another funny pick, well, not necessarily funny, but interesting one, was Mike Huckabee as United States ambassador to Israel. Videos are coming out right now saying, footage of him saying there's no such thing as a West Bank. There's never been a West Bank. It is all Judea and Samaria. And that he's not against a two-state solution, but if there was to be one, the Palestinians would need to find land outside of Palestine. And he mentioned things along the lines of, well, there's obviously places where the Palestinians can go. The Europeans would be more than happy to host them. So that's quite. I mean, I am on as a Palestinian Canadian. I think these appointments don't really mean much. The United States were never once seen as a potential ally for the Palestinian people. We see them as war criminals that cannot really be forgiven, considering the blood they have on their hands in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, um, and well, throughout the Middle East and beyond, right? So I think the Palestinian people are. I mean, these pics. I saw some people, these pro Kamala Harris people saying, well, the Palestinians that didn't vote for Kamala, you get what you wanted. But at the end of the day, I think Palestinians are not naive. They put their focus a lot less on these parliamentary politics in Canada, European Union, or the United States, and the faith really goes in the hands of the resistance in Yemen. The real change is coming from Yemen, come from Iraq, from Lebanon, and from Palestine themselves.
Yeah.
And as long as you put your hope and your faith in the hands of the Americans, you'll be disappointed. You'll be disappointed under Biden, under Trump, and I don't know. I
100%.
mean, yeah,
100%. The people of the region will save themselves.
absolutely,
Foremost.
absolutely, as they have been doing, right? So it was our
Absolutely.
liberation never came from the hands of the West, and if anything, it was just a different form of colonialism that was put onto us. So yeah, so I'm not really flinching to the appointment of Mike Huckabee, Marco Rubio.
What does it change? One thing I want to say about this character Huckabee, and also we should add on that while all of this theater was going on, Netanyahu appointed a character by the name of Yahiel Leiter to be the Israeli ambassador to the United States. He is radically pro-settlement, openly advocates for the annexation of the West Bank. He was in an earlier stage of his life associated with the Kahanist movement, the Jewish Defense League, which the FBI identified as a terrorist organization about 20 years ago. And he was actually born and raised in Scranton, Ohio. Interestingly, he's kind of the epitome of a colonist. In any event, he and Huckabee together are going to make quite a combination. I mean, these guys, I think in a way they may end up doing the Palestinian people a favor, because Israel has annexed the West Bank. De facto, they've annexed the West Bank. They control every inch of the West Bank. They have no intention of leaving. The place is overrun with settlements. The settlers are running amok, committing heinous atrocities against the indigenous Palestinian population with complete impunity, and sometimes even with the assistance and protection of Israel's genocidal military. The only thing that Israel hasn't done to the West Bank is formally call it the territory of Israel. It's done everything but. If these characters actually succeed in getting the Trump administration to recognize and to support Israel's formal annexation of the West Bank, and already the U.S. government has, for decades, supported the de facto annexation of the West Bank. That's why it happened, because the U.S., Canada, Britain, they have always supported the de facto annexation of the West Bank. They've rewarded Israel, showered Israel with support as Israel kept building these settlements that made a two-state solution practically impossible. It's clear what their objectives actually were, despite their rhetoric. So if they do this, if they formalize the annexation, it'll no longer be possible for these two-faced Western politicians to claim that there's a two-state, there's a negotiation that is leading to an eventual Palestinian state. It'll be clear that the two-state solution was a complete fraud. That was never the intention, and we will know what we're dealing with. There will be no doubt about that any longer. We are dealing with a state that is either determined on ethnically cleansing historic Palestine of all Palestinians, or subjecting them to a permanent state of apartheid. It's one or the other.
And when there's an annexation, Dimitri, but there's an obligation to give citizenship to the people of the land that has been annexed. We know that Israel has no interest in giving citizenship. So this illusion, you mentioned the illusion of a two-state solution. Well, it was that illusion that potentially was used to deflect any claims of apartheid. Now, what you call a land with a people without equal rights on it, the Palestinian Authority becomes obsolete. And in some way, you know how they say that Israel is a Jewish democracy, meaning well, it's another word for apartheid, in a sense where, in order to keep its Jewish character, it cannot give Muslims and Christians the right to vote, or even Palestinian who convert to Judaism, right? They would not be able the right to vote. So the illusion of apartheid, if the PA dissolves, in that case, you've forced upon the apartheid nature, and and well, we will have to live. We will have to the similarities between the situation in South Africa and Palestine becomes a lot more visible and apparent.
Yeah.
Um,
Really interesting, Rami, to see what is the Palestinian Authority going to do with its
well,
police forces, who effectively act as an arm of the occupation, if there's a formal annexation? Are they going to dissolve it? Are they going to lose their jobs? And all those armed men, what are they going to do? It'll be very. I think that the Israelis are playing with fire,
well,
and
that's it, and that's what I wanted to say about this. That well, their illusion of creating a system that is a Jewish democracy becomes impossible if the one state solution happens, and in some way, as soon as we're given equal rights as Palestinians on the land, well, then there's this thing. I mean, that's a word that Dan Cohen coined. Well, not necessarily just Dan Cohen, but other people. The demographic threat of Palestinians outnumbering Israelis. So in reality, when people tell us we should be afraid of Trump because he removed the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it was de facto in Jerusalem anyways. All these realities in the
yeah.
ground that Trump is acknowledging are really, I mean, you have to lie to yourself for it not to be true or real.
Mhm.
So
Same thing with the Golan Heights, right, Rami?
absolutely,
Israel
absolutely,
had de facto annexed the Golan Heights, and then
right.
it formally annexed it, and the United States just recognized the reality that Israel has no intention of giving it up. I think this is part of the reason why the national security apparatus hates Trump, is because it's not because he's
It,
humanitarian or a
the
peacenik.
state is imploding, and
It's just
the
the truth.
Israel's existence is in some way imploding as well. Now, there's also another thing I wanted to talk about, and just want to make sure that we have enough time to do some questions for some Q&A. Is the George Ibrahim Abdullah. Well, we've heard earlier this week, I think on the 15th of November, that he would be released from French prison. So now, for people who don't know George Ibrahim Abdullah, he's a Lebanese communist from the city of Akkar in Lebanon, and he's been imprisoned, um, well, since 1987, I believe, and he's considered to be the longest-serving political prisoner in Europe. He was put in prison for the alleged murder of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ray and the U.S. military attaché, as well as an Israeli diplomat, Yaakov Bar. And he was sentenced to life in prison. Now, what's quite shocking is that in 2013, he was supposed to be on parole, right, to be released out of prison. But Emmanuel Valls, I believe the Interior Minister of France at the time, uh, refused to sign his deportation order, right? So he was supposed to be released of prison under condition that he gets deported, and he refused to sign a deportation order, which de facto forced him to stay in jail. But now a judge has ruled that that it's unconstitutional to keep him, and that he must leave, and that in order to bypass the fact that he must be deported, is that he must self exile himself from France. What's particularly interesting over here is this, that the prosecutor of France is trying to overturn the decision to release him from prison. And all of these pressure to keep him in prison comes from the United States and Israel, because he's a great symbol of a bit of this pan-Arabist struggle when it comes to liberating Palestine. This is a Lebanese person who went to France, who did acts of resistance uh, on the behalf of the Palestinian people, and throughout his 40 years in prison, has kept publishing reports in solidarity with political prisoners around the world and the situation in Palestine. And under multiple occasions, he was offered to to have a lighter sentence if he spoke out against the resistance, and he refused to do so. And the entire pro-Palestinian community in France, from La Rochelle to Paris and Marseille, have all used Georges Ibrahim Abdullah as a symbol of liberation of Palestinians within the context of France.
Mhm.
There's been multiple movie screenings, documentaries made about him, and to see that his that he will be released from prison is a huge source of motivation
Mhm.
for the people in France and in Palestine alike to know that, well, these revolutionaries are never forgotten.
Absolutely. We should talk about a not dissimilar story uh, that happened on this side of the pond, involving a Palestinian Canadian doctor by the name of Tarek Loubani. Here, also uh, a somebody who is associated with the resistance, with nonviolent resistance, was subjected to potentially oppression by the legal system. And what happened was Dr. Loubani, who resides in the town I was born and raised in London, in Canada, called London, Ontario, and he's a doctor there, a medical doctor. He frequently has gone to Gaza prior to the commencement of this genocidal rampage to treat Palestinians living in Gaza. I believe he typically worked in Al Shifa Hospital, which has been essentially destroyed by Israel's genocidal military. So Dr. Lubani in 2018 or 19, during the Great March of Return, when Palestinian refugees were walking up to the border fence of the concentration camp Israel had trapped them in and were trying to exercise their right under international law to return to their homeland, they were being gunned down mercilessly, children, journalists, medics. Dr. Lubani was there. He was in the field. He was wearing a white doctor's robe. He was there to actually tend to wounded people. And an Israeli sniper shot him in both legs. And on the same day, shot through the chest a medic on his team and killed him. And within 3 weeks, within 3 weeks of this widely reported assault on a Canadian citizen, well-respected doctor in Canada, the Trudeau government entered into an enhanced free trade agreement with Israel. Okay, basically giving the big middle finger to the interests of a Canadian citizen who had been brutalized by Israel's military, a doctor no less. So let's fast forward to October of last year. Dr. Lubani is in London, Ontario. He's quite distraught at the support that the Canadian government is showing to the Israeli regime, which at that time is making genocidal declarations and has begun to implement a policy of genocide. And he goes to the offices, the local offices of a liberal member of parliament by the name of Peter Fragiskatos. He actually used to be my MP when I lived in London, Ontario. And he sprays ketchup on the door to Fragiskatos' office, to symbolize the blood of Palestinians being spilt by Israel and its Western backers. And Fragiskatos gets all upset, starts whining to the media, starts making noises about how this is vandalization and it's anti-democratic and it's beyond the pale. And so prosecutors in London, Ontario charged Dr. Lubani with mischief under the criminal code. Well, last week on Tuesday, there was a hearing at which Dr. Lubani was present with his lawyer, and the prosecutor announced to the judge that the charges were being dropped. And I'm not just paraphrasing. I mean, basically, there was nothing to this charge. There was absolutely no basis. And frankly, it would have been a violation, a severe violation of Dr. Lubani's right to free expression and freedom of association under the Charter, the Canadian Constitution. So they dropped the charges, and Dr. Lubani promptly gets in a vehicle, goes back to the offices of Peter Fragiskatos, and sprays more ketchup on his door, which I thought was a rather remarkable display of civil disobedience. And although it is, in the grand scheme of things, not a crushing victory for the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, it does show that the justice system, at the end of the day, does work from time to time in favor of Palestinians. And I think the reason for that is simply that you have to play by the rules in the courts of law to a large degree. In the public domain, you can say anything. You can lie about anything and get away with it. There are no consequences. The corporate media are constantly filling us with misinformation. But in a court of law, you have to satisfy a judge that your actions are consistent with established legal principles. You have to give testimony under oath. If you lie and you're caught lying, you could go to jail for perjury. You have to be subjected to cross-examination. So in that environment, I'm not saying that it's, perfectly fair for Palestinians. It isn't. But in that environment, it's much harder for Zionists to get away with the dishonesty and the disregard for law and human rights that they oftentimes get away with in a non-legal context. Um, and the other thing I think we should talk about before we open it up to some Q&A is the events in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Um,
So, I
why
mean,
don't we,
we
why don't
spoke
we
about,
talk about that,
yeah,
Rami?
we spoke about this a bit last week, right? We called on, we reported about the lies that the media was spreading related to how the events unfolded. We've known from the beginning that the Maccabi Tel Aviv hooligans were ripping around Palestinian flags, targeting taxi drivers, assaulting people. And I mean, just in the past few days, we've seen Canadian media and, well, also the was a police report that was released by the Amsterdam police, mentioning that, well, everything that we were saying, that the Maccabi Tel Aviv hooligans were the ones initiating the chaos in Amsterdam. Now, of course, media and governments are very slow at responding to these reports and admitting their own complicity in this fake news being promoted. Dimitri, I think you've mentioned that Elizabeth May ended up quietly deleting her tweet. CBC News just did like a tiny little report that didn't get as much uh, visibility around how these reports were fake. And then, even more, just on the 14th of November, there was a football match between Israel and France in the Stade de France, and around 7,000 people ended up going to the match in a stadium that could host over 85,000 people. Macron and his stooges tried to, well, they went to the match trying to make a symbol against anti-Semitism, as if this had nothing to do with Palestine and people assaulting pro-Palestinian uh, citizens in Amsterdam. But the truth is coming out, and
Yeah, can we go to the Elizabeth May tweet number one so people can see what we're talking
yes,
about here? So,
yes, yes, yes,
and just while Rami's getting that, for those of you who don't know, Elizabeth May is the leader of the Green Party of Canada, and she is a member of the Canadian Parliament, and has been for now, I think, in excess of 12 years, maybe 13 years, she's been a member of Parliament. And she likes to pose as the most pro-Palestinian member of Parliament. And I can tell you from personal experience, because I actually served in her shadow cabinet as the justice critic back in 2016. I ran to be leader of the Green Party of Canada. I can tell you from personal experience that Elizabeth May, when it comes to Palestinian rights, is very much a poser. And I think that this event, what happened in Amsterdam, is indicative of that. And just by way of background, on the day, uh, the morning after these clashes happened in the streets of Amsterdam, I woke up and I saw all over social media claims from Zionists that there were pogroms against Jews in Amsterdam on the prior night. And I didn't see in any of the many tweets that I saw and other social media posts which made this claim, I didn't see any reference at all to Maccabi Tel Aviv, this Israeli football club. I didn't even see any reference to Israel. They simply said that there were attacks on Jewish persons. And my impression from reading these posts was that Jewish persons living in Amsterdam, Europeans, Jews, were being randomly chosen and set upon by anti Semitic thugs. That's the clear impression that these posts conveyed. And then I started checking alternative media and quickly realized or learned that, in fact, there had been a European football match the night before, football in the European sense, not the American sense. Uh, and it involved an Israeli soccer club named Maccabi Tel Aviv. I knew right then and there that I was being lied to, because I actually am the only sport I care about or follow is European football. In fact, I've been a lifelong football fan. I played, for my varsity soccer team. I got a tryout with a professional team when I was a young man. So this is a sport I know very well. I care very deeply about it. And I knew that Maccabi Tel Aviv was reputed to be the second most racist football club in Israel. And the most racist club, according to local observers, is Beitar Jerusalem. But Maccabi Tel Aviv is right behind. So that immediately, I knew that we were being lied to about what happened in Amsterdam. And sure enough, as I began to look further, others began to look further. We found videos where these Maccabi fans were chanting "Death to Arabs." There are no more schools in Gaza because there are no children in Gaza, and so forth. But immediately out of the gate, when these mendacious posts started to appear, claiming that the Jews were being randomly set upon by anti-Semitic thugs in Amsterdam, Elizabeth May puts out this tweet. So if you could just pop it back up on the screen, Rami. It's literally within hours. She didn't take the time to inform herself. And you'll see she says, on behalf of Canadian Greens, I am horrified by anti-Semitic attack on Israeli soccer fans in Amsterdam. We condemn such hate, ironically learned of it while attending an event commemorating Kristallnacht, horror of 86 years ago. So do you see a reference there to a Maccabi Tel Aviv? Do you see any acknowledgement that these Maccabi fans said death to Arabs? There were videos out by that point, by the way, which showed this. Do you see any acknowledgement that they were saying there's no schools in Gaza because there are no more children, or they were tearing down Palestinian flags, which we now know they did? There's no acknowledgement whatsoever. Right. So if you exactly, and who were apparently of Moroccan descent. So can you pull up tweet number 2, the second tweet about Elizabeth May? So we can't see the top of it. I think that's the CBC article. If you look, at Elizabeth May 2, that's what it's called. Do you see that one?
Let's see. Elizabeth May 2.
Okay, so immediately after she put out her tweet, I tweeted and I tagged her. She knows me. She follows me on Twitter. We know each other very well. And I asked her, are you competing with Poilievre, that's a Conservative Party leader, and Prime Minister Trudeau to become Canada's leading purveyor of Zionist lies? And I attached to my tweet, my question, an article which had already come out in the Middle East Eye about Israeli hooligans provoking clashes in Amsterdam after chanting anti-Palestinian slogans. She left that tweet up there for a week, and as you can see from the top of the image that appears, she's now deleted it. Now, the point I want to make here is she's a poser. She's not really somebody who is committed to the Palestinian cause. What she tries to do is she tries to position herself slightly to the pro-Palestinian side of the other parties in parliament, which are fanatically pro-Israel, with the possible exception of the NDP. The Liberals, the Conservatives, and the Bloc, they're pretty much fanatically pro-Israel, so that she can pick up the votes of Canadians who actually care about Palestinian lives. But at the same time, she won't go far enough, or tries to avoid going far enough in support of Palestinians to incur the wrath of Zionist organizations. And this tweet she put out was a perfect example of this. She was pandering without having done any due diligence at all. It would have been very simple for her to ascertain what the reality was. She was pandering to the Zionist lobby by repeating their lies about Amsterdam. And after she did the damage by leaving that tweet up for 8 weeks, she quietly deleted the dishonest tweet. But the damage has been done. Most people will not know she deleted her tweet.
Dimitri, this whole Amsterdam thing gets even more wild because yesterday Israel did its usual attacks on Beirut, indiscriminate bombing of residential blocks, and it ended up hitting a Lebanese female national football team player named Celine Haidar, and she was targeted and hit, and she was left alone to, well, severely. Well, at some point, people thought she was dead, but she ended up being brought to the hospital in a coma, and she still is at the ICU right now. Now, this is a professional Lebanese woman football player. The UEFA, obviously UEFA's in Europe, but the FIFA didn't say a single comment yet about a football player getting hit. We've heard them speak and condemn in Ukraine and around the world. We know that Russia is banned from participating under its own flag in most sporting events, if not all of them.
Certainly, in FIFA, it's been expelled from all European football competitions
So
within weeks.
now we have a Lebanese player getting hit and in a coma at the moment in ICU, and we're not getting the same level of response
Mhm.
that the West have done when it came to these
Mhm.
fascists walking around Amsterdam and targeting Arabs, right? And claiming to be victims.
Yeah.
We have actual football players now in hospitals in ICU, and not a single Western government, media, or even like a sporting association condemning the targeting of athletes. And this goes beyond Lebanon. We know in Gaza, multiple players for either in the Palestinian Football League or even in the Palestinian national football team are being targeted and killed, yet uh, they're not getting any form of support or love
Mhm.
from
Mhm.
the international community, right? So this goes, I mean, it's comical to see the timing of the whole thing happening in Amsterdam and France getting massive exposure. And when the worst thing that could happen, right, which is
Yeah.
what happened to Sin Haider, it's radio silence.
And the last thing I'll say about this, Rami, is this is so absurd. The hypocrisy is so mind-blowing. Israel is not even part of Europe. Israel is in West Asia, and yet Israel has been invited to participate in European football competitions. Okay, it doesn't take part in competitions in its own region. It comes to Europe, where it's welcomed with open arms while it's committing a brazen genocide. Russia is part of Europe, but Russia has been expelled from all European football competitions for over 2 years. So if you had any, and we're told, the European football, UEFA, the Union of European Football Associations, and FIFA, they say, oh, we're not supposed to politicize football. Well, they've done that. They politicize football by expelling Russia. These people have absolutely no shame whatsoever. So, anyways, I had to get that off my chest. Rami, thank you very much for helping me through this cathartic evening. So, maybe we should take a few questions from
So
the audience.
people that have questions, please type them down on the YouTube link, since I'm not getting the messages from Twitter. Now, just in the meanwhile, Dimitri Lascaris, we could, as the questions start coming in, um, we had an exciting week this week. I released a report on the elections in Georgia, and as well as you released an interview with Yipeng Ji, a Canadian doctor who was heavily targeted for showing just an inch of support. Well, not an inch. She did a lot more than an inch, but for showing just some humanity to the Palestinian people. That was extremely interesting interview. And you also spoke to Dan Cohen, who's a good friend of mine, and that was quite an interesting talk as well.
Mhm.
Any behind the scene thoughts of these conversations that you've had?
Yeah, Yiping Yi, a doctor at the University of Ottawa, he was targeted by an associate professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa late last year because he was expressing sympathy for Palestinians on social media. And this doctor, his name is Yoni Friedman. And you can go to his Twitter feed. His name is, I think it's at Yoni Friedman, is his X handle. And, this guy is fanatical about promoting Israel. And he even has pinned a post from the Israeli military. That's at the very top of his feed on X. So when I interviewed Yipeng Yi, I tagged Yoni Friedman. I'd never had any interaction with him before on social media or otherwise. I tagged him and I asked the question, how can a so-called doctor support Israel after a UN independent commission of inquiry just determined that Israel had committed the crime against humanity of extermination by systematically and deliberately destroying Gaza's medical system. That's what the UN Commission of Inquiry determined last month. And here you have this character who calls himself a medical doctor doing everything possible to promote Israel. Not surprisingly, this got quite a bit of reaction, positive reaction, my comment on social media. And this thin skinned, Zionist fanatic immediately blocked me. But at least I'm gratified in knowing that a lot of people out there have, learned about this incident because really Yipeng Ji is an extraordinary member of Canada's medical profession. He's a great Canadian, in my opinion, a young man who has put the interests of human rights and oppressed people ahead of his own career advancement. So I strongly urge you to, if you're not familiar with his work, you should follow him. He went to Gaza after this. He was suspended from the University of Ottawa. By the way, they reinstated him, but he refused to go back because he felt that they did not really understand the harm that they had done. And after that, he then went to Gaza and worked in a medical clinic for a week. So please try to learn more about Yipeng Ji. He deserves our support.
So I have a couple of questions lined up. Oh God. The first question that I was able to find is, Dimitri, will you do more investigative reports similar to the last one in Cyprus? That was really good.
Thank you. Yes, so for those you don't know, this was a report on Israelis coming to Cyprus, buying up everything in sight. Speaking to local activists on the ground, I managed to learn about what were the main sort of business investments they were making and where the Israeli expats were congregating. I really enjoy investigative reporting, and I definitely want to do more investigative reports in the future. And some of you may have noticed that recently I monetized my YouTube channel. And the reason that I did that is because my expenses from frontline reporting, I had no income from journalism at all up until about 3 months ago. My expenses from frontline reporting were becoming quite substantial. So I monetized. I'm sorry, for being in a position to have to do this in order to cover at least some of my expenses. The more that I'm able to earn from the monetization, the more I will be able to report from the front line. And not just me, also we'd like to get Rami and in the future, we'd like to expand and have other correspondents. We're going to do investigative reporting, frontline reporting for Reason2Resist all over the world.
And on my end, Dimitri, I'm planning on going to Tunisia to do a report on Hammam Shat, which I mentioned earlier on. It's a city in Tunisia, that was attacked by Israel in 1985, I believe. So that's, I think, and there's not much information or resources on YouTube about this, and I think that's quite something interesting that people would learn a lot about. There's a few more questions. Dimitri, let me know when we get a bit tired. So the next one that I had was, do you think the latest case against the Canadian government for their role in the genocide will deter the government from further complicity in Israeli crimes and compel them to follow the law? Since you have a bit of a stake in this, Dimitri, or a role in this, would be quite good to have your opinion.
So thank you for the question. On November 5th, which was actually Election Day in the United States, I and 6 other lawyers from across Canada filed a claim in the Ontario courts against the Canadian government on behalf of 2 Palestinian Canadians who have lost dozens of family members in Gaza. And one of them was actually in Gaza on October 7th and was almost killed in an Israeli airstrike. And our claim has essentially 2 parts. Number one, we say that the Canadian government has violated its obligation under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. And just so you know, under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, it's not enough for a state that is a party to the convention to refrain from committing genocide. The parties to the convention have to take actual steps, positive, affirmative steps, to stop a genocide when there is a material risk that genocide is happening or about to occur. So that's the first part of our claim. And the second part of our claim is that the government is violating our clients' rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to security of the person and to equality. And we argue, amongst other things, that if you compare Canada's foreign policy, for example, with respect to Ukraine, to its foreign policy with respect to Palestinians, it is absolutely clear that the policy is discriminatory. And we say that the Canadian government policy towards Palestine and Israel is reflective of a deep anti-Palestinian racism within the Canadian political and economic elite. In any event, to get to the brunt of the point of the question, yeah, we do believe that this can have the effect of shaming the government into action. At least uh, putting an end, for example, to the transfer of weapons to Israel and the purchase of weapons from Israel, which have continued throughout the genocide. It would be an indelible stain on the record of any government, including that of Justin Trudeau, if a Canadian court, after examining all of the evidence, determined that they were violating the Genocide Convention and were discriminating against Palestinian Canadians. I think the government is going to be desperate to avoid that stain, and we're probably in for an epic legal battle.
There's a comment here that says, oops, this was not the one I wanted to share. There's a comment here that says, Dimitri started buying me a coffee page. There is a Patreon and a Substack link that you could find on any of the videos. So if you ever want, you could go there. Other question that I had was, I'm going to try to share the questions on screen if I find them, but I'm just, the chat is just hard to follow. So I copy paste them. Do you know about the Bronfman family here in Montreal? Charlie Bronfman is the founder of Birthright. His son, Stephen Bronfman, is the treasurer of the Liberal Party as we speak. Quite a notable family in Montreal. I think one of the main buildings in McGill is called the Bronfman Building.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a family that, I mean, I can't add much more to what our comrade said in the question. This is a family that has a long history of Zionism and funding Zionist causes and promoting politicians like Justin Trudeau, who are fundamentally Zionist and profoundly anti-racist at the end of the day when you look at their policies, putting aside whatever their rhetoric may be. And there's no shortage of people like that in Canada, not just, of course, from the Jewish community. There are a lot of people, evangelical Christians, people who call themselves Christians, let's be very clear, whether they are Christians is another matter altogether, who are extremely supportive of Israel, financially, politically, rhetorically, and one of the very worst is Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. He, by all appearances, is a Christian evangelical, or at least regards himself as one. Stephen Harper, arguably the most pro-Israel prime minister in the history of this country, was a fanatical Zionist. And also, he claimed to be a Christian. So there's no shortage of people like that in positions of power in this country. But I do believe that they reflect a minority point of view. Most Canadians do not want this country to support Israel any longer. I think that's absolutely clear.
There's an interesting question over here, which it says, Dimitri and Rami, what strategies do you think are most effective here in Canada? There's an active grassroots movement, many community groups at work, but more strategic coordination is needed.
Since you're such an accomplished organizer, especially at Concordia, I'd invite you to answer that question.
Yeah. So I was actually called on Monday to do a little presentation to a group of Concordia students that are organizing a strike at the university in solidarity with the Palestinian people and against Concordia students that were targeted by administration for protest for solidarity with Palestine. And one thing that was particularly interesting in the actions, in the strike that is happening in Montreal, in University across Montreal on 21st and 22nd of November, is that it's in conjunction with anti-NATO organizing, or it's condemning NATO's conference happening here in Montreal. So I think to be extremely, extremely effective, it's important to position what the Palestinian liberation movement is within the greater structure, right? We have forces of evil, which is what I call NATO, that is looking to expand and assert some form of world domination and controlling any form of countries that is looking for a relative amount of self-determination, right? Looking for NATO expansion eastward and bordering almost Iran. We're talking about getting Georgia to join there. So I think the first piece of advice that I would say is keeping Palestine within the greater context of Western hegemony, which is at the end of the day what is oppressing Palestinians and everyone around the world. And I would also say that within the context of, I mean, I've been pretty much lately a lot less hopeful. I've seen some comments in the chat over here. Are you still do you still put your hope in the courts? I would put my hope a lot less into the West in general. So, I mean, I was going to say stop listening to Western journalists, which is me and Dimitri Lascaris. But on a different note, I would say try to position yourselves in getting access to media from people that are a bit less that have a better of understanding of geopolitics, and understand the different mechanisms that are oppressing us, right? So mainstream media being obviously the worst place to start, and I don't mean this as a some tinfoil hat person, but just in general, right? We're seeing amazing independent journalism happening with people like Dimitri, Judge Napolitano, Scott Ritter, Laith Marouf, and Ali Murtada, and all these great people that are, putting things in proper perspective. And I think I was involved in student unions and in Palestine organizing, and I met up with an old friend of mine in London the other day, and he told me that any effort that you do has to be strategic and be able to lead to some level of greater escalation and maintain that level of effort. And I think what he meant by this is that well, there's a lot of measures that we do, and then we end up getting lost in the way it's being applied. Um, whether it is um, whether it is like, for example, in Montreal, we had an encampment that lasted 4 months or so, if not longer. And I think that there's some form of strategy that we could put in place that are less. It's how do we maximize the impact of the efforts that we're putting in and getting the most outcome out of it. So I've been speaking to a lot of people as part of the encampments that were saying just keeping the encampment alive was an extreme measure. And I think there's other measures that could be put in place, other activities that could be put in place that will have a great impact, whether it is strategic encampments that you set up and then turn off, at regular intervals. So the police is always mobilized and not knowing where to go. So creating that level of, I think there should be a guerrilla approach to any form of active protest that people put. Not sure if that answers the question. But Dimitri, if you do you have anything to add on this?
No, that was quite comprehensive. Thank you, Rami.
Um,
So there was another question I saw. We're getting close to the end
yeah,
by Paul. Now it's gone off the screen, but I thought the question was whether Arab countries are going to get together with Iran in order to resist once and for all Western Israeli hegemony in the region. Sorry, Paul, I'm paraphrasing your question, but um, well, we've seen signs of that already. There was the uh, Dimitri, are we at the stage where Arab countries will join Iran? Self-interest BRICS. Yeah, we're seeing signs of that already, tentative steps with the Iranian head of state. I think the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, or it was the foreign minister, just visited Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia were both involved in naval drills recently. There was the detente, fragile as it may be, that was mediated by the Chinese government between Saudi Arabia and Iran at a summit that was held last week involving Muslim nations. I believe both Iran and Saudi Arabia were present there. The Saudi crown prince referred to what Israel is doing as a genocide. And this is at the level of governments where there has been quite a bit of division with respect to Israel. With respect to the grassroots, I see tremendous amount of unity. You know, in West Asia, I think what's happening is kind of a micro example of what's happening on a broader scale across the world, where U.S. government and Western government aggression and domination and disrespect for the sovereignty of other states has driven China and Russia together into a close strategic partnership, an unbreakable strategic partnership, which I don't think the West has the power to dominate. And now Israel in the region of West Asia is doing exactly the same thing. It seems to me they are bringing together the peoples of the region to finally terminate once and for all the heinous impacts of Western domination of the region. The few regions in the world have been as adversely affected by this project of Western global hegemony as West Asia. It's just absolutely horrifying what they've done.
Dimitri, I just also want to say, I mean, I don't hold much respect for the governments of Saudi Arabia, but I think they were sold an illusion that peace with Israel brings security. Um, the October 7th shattered the illusion of Israel being able to afford any sense of security to anyone in the region, let alone themselves. Now, if you're Saudi Arabia in that context, you care about prosperity for Saudi Arabia, and you know that Israel is no guarantee of prosperity for yourself. You have a declining empire, the United States. You have Israel that cannot even beat Hamas or like finish the situation in Gaza. It's stuck into a war for 1 year, and they're talking it's going to go on for another year. They're not able to provide any form of gain or success in the south of Lebanon. And then, if you care for the survival of your own country, well, you look at who possibly has the balance of power in the region, and in some way, it's a lot more Iran than Israel. So, if you're Saudi Arabia and we're pushing you to start the war with Iran, as they've been doing in the past few years, and then you see how Ukraine was basically thrown into the slaughterhouse for Western goals, then you know that when the Americans are hyping you up to fight Iran as a Saudi or as a person from the Gulf, then you know that this form of support is not very material and doesn't really hold the best interests of the people of Saudi Arabia. So I mean, I could see more, and I could see bigger rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, it's not because they finally found a light, but it's because it is not the wise position to be on Israel's side or to normalize with Israel. It's
Right.
going to not bring any form of just value. And I just say this from a pragmatic standpoint. I mean,
Yeah, it's not in their self-interest. I think they're exactly right. They're coming to realize that they've been sold a false bill of goods. In any event, it's now past 8 o'clock, Rami. Unless there's another question you really think we should take, I think we might want to
I
wrap
could
it
wrap
up.
it up, and I will tell you guys all that. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this live stream. This is our second live stream. We try to be quite consistent, and Dimitri, I think unless there's significant material change happening in the world, we will most likely be talking together on Sunday at 6 p.m. There's cool reports coming up this week, cool interviews. Dimitri, can we leak some names on the people that you've been interviewing?
Well, I've arranged to interview Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone. We've scheduled that for Thursday, so we'll probably be publishing that on Friday. I'm trying to interview my good friend Rehab Nazal, the Palestinian Canadian artist. She's been on my show several times. She's in the West Bank. She has family in Jenin. She is an extraordinarily courageous woman of the resistance. I actually did an episode featuring Rehab that was called Women of the Resistance. So I haven't been able to talk to her for several weeks. I'm going to try to interview her this week. And hopefully we'll be able to get an update also from geopolitical analyst in Beirut, Laith Marouf.
And we will also try to cover the NATO conference happening in Montreal and the hopeful chaos that will happen in the streets of Montreal to ensure that NATO is not welcome in
Absolutely.
Canada.
Sorry, thanks for reminding me. That's a big one, Rami. That's the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is happening in Montreal on November 26th to 25th, and we intend to be there.
So, folks, it was a pleasure having you all here, and I hope you guys learned something. Thank you for the great questions, and we will see you next Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time.
Peace, everybody. Take care.